is that twinkling?
Okay, selamat pagi. Good morning, everybody. This is our session number 4 for this year, Monash Indonesian Discussion Series. My name is Rani Pulungan. I'm the Subject Librarian for Indonesian Studies. Welcome to Matheson. So today we are going to hear from Dr. Megan Downs, who will be talking about consuming conservation media and the environment in Indonesia. But before that, I also would like to remind some of you, we do have display from Indonesian collection here that I've picked. The theme for today is to do with environment and resources in Indonesia. Have a look at it. And as most of you already know, the Indonesian collection is located on level 1 of Matheson Library, and the general collection, we also have some in the general collection. Before I handed it over to Pak Ariel, I would also like to remind you that on Monday, we launch arts and activism display featuring Alit Ambara, one of most prolific posters artists in Indonesia. So the event was held on Monday evening. There were quite a number of guests that we had, which was really nice to see people, given that it was the first day of Ramadan. So we still have the posters up in teaching room 3, which is not far from this room. If some of you are interested in looking at the posters, I'm more than happy to take you there after the discussion. All right. Without further ado, I will be handing this over to Pak Ariel, who is going to introduce our speaker today. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Rennie. Let me begin by acknowledging the peoples of the Kulin nations on whose land we gathered today, and I pay my respect to their elders past and present. I also need to remind you to switch off your silent mode on your telephone if you have not done so. It is such a great pleasure for me to welcome Meg Downs, with whom I've been working for the past maybe 12, 13 years in 3 GO8 universities, from Melbourne University, where I used to work with Merle. I work with her also at ANU. I'm currently still working with her for a project sponsored by DFAT. We nearly completed that. Meg has recently completed her postdoctoral fellowship at the National University of Singapore Asia Research Institute. Her research areas include environmental humanities, urban youth, and the politics of media and popular culture, with a particular focus on contemporary Indonesia. She is also the recipient of 2 Australian Government Endeavour Awards. So please join me in welcoming Meg with her topic, consuming conservation media and the environment in Indonesia.
Hello, thank you very much, Ariel, and to the Have Faith Indonesia Engagement Centre, to Anita and Reni and the team at Matheson Library. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all today. Is my mic all clear enough? Everyone can hear? Excellent. So today I'll be discussing media and popular cultural representations of environmental issues in Indonesia. So the kind of images and stories that surround us every day in television, film, advertising, social media, and so on, that we often don't think so much about. But these stories in the media both reflect and shape our ideas about the natural environment. They offer a window into popular perceptions and a potential medium for transforming such perceptions. Now, as you know, Indonesia has a very rich and diverse natural environment. Sometimes called the lungs of the earth, it's home to 1/3 of all natural tropical rainforests and has the 2nd highest levels of biodiversity worldwide. But there are also some major ecological crises going on. So Indonesia is the number 3 emitter of greenhouse gases worldwide, the number 2 contributor to plastic pollution after China, and there's very high deforestation rates because Indonesia provides more than 50% of the world's palm oil supply. And this is, of course, part of a much wider global crisis. So in coming years, we'll see more extreme weather events, disasters, crop failures, food crises, climate refugees, and so on. But while scientists have been warning us about this for decades, we haven't necessarily been doing much about it. So what I try to do with my research is to explore the everyday narratives and power structures that influence people's interactions with the natural environment and make a case for how the study of media and of popular culture can contribute to the environmental humanities, helping us to understand and to confront some of these crises. And so with this kind of little bit of background in mind, oh, why has it skipped so far? Okay, this is the one we need. So with this in mind, I'll be presenting 3 little scenes today. And so the first one involves an advertising campaign around the Lippo Group's new city, Meikarta, that will apparently allow those who can afford it to leave all Jakarta's environmental problems behind. The second scene is based around a film called 5 Centimetres, which prompted a real surge in what I call environmental nationalism among young Indonesian travellers. And thirdly, I'll look at how people consume the natural environment and conservation messages through social media platforms like Instagram. And now key themes will emerge across these scenes, and I'll show how the images and the symbolism used in each example tap into common everyday stories about pollution, class, morality, development, personal responsibility, and national progress. And my reflections today on these scenes are based on close readings of each text and also on focus group discussions and polling during my fieldwork over the past few years in Indonesia. And when I say texts here, I mean this in a very broad sense. So I've included examples today from television advertising, from cinematic entertainment, and from social media. And I'm interested in reading these, so looking at what kind of common stories and themes emerge across the different mediums, what kind of characters, plots, genre conventions, tropes, and moral messages tend to keep coming up about the environment. And I've deliberately chosen 3 different genres, I suppose, to look at some of the opportunities and challenges of each. So kind of an advertisement that's meant to sell something is going to have a very different set of kind of limitations and possibilities compared to, say, a commercial film or somebody's Instagram feed. But first, one reason why it's so vital to look at media representations of the environment is the relatively limited formal environmental education in Indonesia. So the most effective environmental education mainly happens through community or NGO-run programs rather than at school. And the most recent new national curriculum back in 2013 was described as a real missed opportunity that almost completely neglected environmental education. In fact, there was even less environmental education than in previous curriculums. And so Lynn Parker's done a detailed study of this curriculum and has explained that what is missing is education that alerts students to human responsibility for the destruction of the natural world, that informs them about the socio-political systems that drive this destruction, that develops their understanding of their own place in these systems, and that equips them with hope and capacity for pro-environment social action. And so in this context, the stories circulating in media and pop culture are very important as a potential alternate site for finding that hope and finding that capacity. So the mediascape is a huge cultural reservoir of images, meanings, and definitions, and our understandings of the environment are often drawn from here. As Hansen has noted, while the role of formal education should not be overlooked, much of what we know about the environment we know from the media, and this applies not only to our beliefs and knowledge about environmental problems, but also the ways in which we perceive and value nature and the natural environment. Now, this study of environmental communication is a very important and growing field, but while much existing work has focused on news reportage and print media, I'm really looking at creative representations and the role that narrative, visual, and aesthetic forms play in drawing attention to and shaping our ideas about environmental issues. And I'm particularly interested in the realm of pop culture, as it's full of stories, big and little, from a 2-minute advertisement through to a 2-hour movie. And stories are just so vital, because just abstractly knowing about environmental problems does not guarantee that governments, businesses, or individuals will do anything about them, as I think has become quite clear. Dipesh Chakrabarty has argued that our success in developing a globally concerted response to the climate crisis will depend on the degree to which we can tell stories that we can all agree on. And narrative is just such a vital part of the process by which we as humans make sense of crises in public life or feel inspired to work towards solutions. So what we need is a kind of inspiring, inclusive narratives, and also to be more critical of narratives that are pushing kind of more divisive messages. And so on that note, I would like to turn to our first story of the day. And I'm going to play you the advertisement for Maycarta, which is a real estate development, a new city being built by the Lippo Group. They're a big conglomerate who own lots of media channels as well as malls and real estate developments in Indonesia. And this ad was everywhere during the past couple of years. Lippo really used their media influence to saturate the airwaves with it. And I think Anita will help me press play on this.
Terkadang kita lupa.
Sometimes we forget.
Kehidupan yang kita jalani menjadi seperti ini.
Our life has become like this.
Bawa aku pergi dari sini.
Take me away from here.
Kita lupa bahwa ada cara lain untuk hidup.
We forget there are other ways of living.
Cara mudah untuk menggapai cita.
Easier ways to achieve our dreams.
Kita lupa semua ini dapat menjadi milik kita.
We forget all this could be
Aku ingin
ours.
pindah ke Mekarta.
I want to move to Maycarta. All right. So, there you go. It is possible to leave behind all of Jakarta's social and environmental problems and move to Maycarta instead. That's if it actually gets built, of course. So Maycarta's future is now in question after a whole lot of corruption allegations and delays and building permit issues. So, you know, don't bank on having this utopia to move to. But I'm kind of interested in some of the images that are happening in this ad. So we can see in the opening scene really visible markers of pollution. We've got smog, rubbish, dirty rivers, and there's also a kind of moral pollution going on here. So people are selfish, uncaring, even criminal. And this is really classic use of pollution imagery and something we find a lot. So linking social and physical filth. And the suggestion is perhaps that people stealing bags and people polluting waterways are both symptoms of an underlying moral decay. And now, this notion that pollution is fundamentally a personal, moral issue is a very common trope in Indonesia. So in everyday conversations, I found that people are either quite personally self-depreciating, so saying, oh, I'm too lazy to make an effort not to litter, I'm not rajin or dedicated enough. Or they'll blame others for not being rajin enough. So I've come across so often the problem being defined as people are uneducated, people are lazy, they don't care, we need to change their mindset. These are the phrases that keep coming up a lot in my research. And of course, some level of personal responsibility is important, but the problem with overemphasising the personal morality dimensions of pollution is that such a story can really erase systemic problems. So in the case of Jakarta, there's a real lack of disposal infrastructure for the tens of thousands of tonnes of waste produced daily. And an increasing one-use disposable plastic culture is also an incredibly systemic problem, not just in Jakarta, but globally. But the Maycarta ad has proposed a very easy solution, which is simply leave. And so what happens once we get to this promised land? We've got clear skies, green space, a luxurious lifestyle. And I think we can't ignore the issue of class here, because it looks here like enjoyment of pollution-free nature is an exclusive privilege of the wealthy. And one possible inference from this is that it was Jakarta's urban poor who contributed to the squalor of that previous scene. And this is another common trope that I keep coming up against, this idea that the lower class canal dwellers fill the waterways with waste and simply don't know any better. And so these local residents often unfairly bear the brunt of blame for problems like flooding, and this is despite the fact that the biggest waste producers are big industries, and the main cause of urban flooding is inappropriate land developments like Maycarta through kind of large-scale concrete-heavy projects. And this kind of blame game also happens with other big environmental issues like logging and forest fires. So it's the small-scale farmers who are often blamed for being uneducated, while the real problem actually lies with the giant palm oil production companies making some of their choices impossible for those small-scale farmers. And in Jakarta, it may be those riverside communities that have to live in closest proximity to the garbage, but the waste itself is produced by everyone. And on the subject of waste, you can see that Maycarta is really strongly promoting consumption. So in some of these screenshots, we can see that enjoying the natural environment is for children, while enjoying instant shopping is for adults. And overconsumption is a huge contributor to the big environmental problems of our time. But there's nothing in the Lipo Group's Maycarta story about reducing disposable fashion or single-use plastic. It's not even a particularly eco-looking city. There's still heaps of cars, and it's doesn't have many kind of green markers going on. And that pollution we saw earlier in the ad was framed as kind of an inconvenient eyesore, not something linked to broader issues such as climate change, which, like it or not, is going to affect those living in Maycarta too. But of course, when we look at ads like this, it's all very well to talk about the official story that the company is intending to present. But another important aspect is audience interpretation. So people are never completely uncritical consumers, and they actively engage with the mass media in ironic and playful ways. And we can see this here through all of these parody videos on YouTube. There were hundreds of them for a while. And also this excellent sign I came across on a tip jar at a cafe, which reads, "We want to move to Maycarta," as if, a few tips are going to help with that. And so ads like this can then become signifiers representing broader issues of importance to audiences. So in the case of Maycarta, references to the city become shorthand for a kind of playful class-based critique that pokes fun at the absurdity of Maycarta as a solution to Jakarta's problems. But despite all of these parodies, the Maycarta ad does definitely tap into some powerful assumptions in contemporary Indonesia, including this idea of personal moral responsibility for pollution, which is pretty widespread and central to many public campaigns, and also the classic trope of poor people pollute the rivers. And so when I've been conducting polls with Indonesian students and kind of making word clouds of some of the most important things, important environmental issues and who's responsible, these assumptions have also been really strong. So in Indonesia, I've had the strongest response about kind of individuals being responsible for environmental issues. When I've conducted these elsewhere, there's definitely not such a strong focus on individual responsibility. And this kind of blurring of the line between social issues, moral issues, and environmental issues also comes up a lot. So the word lingkungan, or environment, in Indonesian has much broader connotations than just lingkungan hidup, or kind of the natural world. So when you kind of talk about the idea of lingkungan, people often bring up social issues as well. So kind of for brainstorming big environmental problems, things like bullying, terrorism, these issues come up as well. And this can be really frustrating for some environmental researchers because I've spoken to people who are like, but that's not an environmental issue. But I actually think it's a really great opportunity because so many environmental issues are also linked to social injustices. And yeah, that's something I might like to talk about a little bit later as well. yeah, because I think this blurring between social and physical environmental issues is a really kind of useful entry point. But that was our first scene, Me Kata, and ultimately the overarching story here is not really about fixing Jakarta or about dealing with environmental problems or addressing overconsumption or dangerous development projects. It's about escaping. And so on that note of escape, we're going to turn to another kind of story, a film called 5 Centimeters. Several months after this film release, I was chatting to some of the salespeople at Ray Outdoor Gear, and they were telling me that their business had really been growing with people inspired by stories like this to go off on adventures of their own. Local students in Malang, close to the mountain, also told me that after 5 Centimeters, more and more groups started passing through on their way to climb the mountain. And seasoned mountain climbers were complaining that most of the hikers who have been lured by the film do not have enough knowledge or awareness of proper mountain climbing techniques or respect for the local ecosystem. The management of Bromo Tenggar Semeru National Park even became concerned that this craze for conquering Semeru had gone too far, and they brought in all these new regulations to protect the park from the flood of visitors. But for the amateur hikers, reenacting this story was an important way to strengthen their friendships and deepen their love of Indonesia. And during my conversations with young Indonesians, I sensed that this 5 Centimeter story and Mount Semeru had become symbols of friendship and of nationalist awakening. Now, scenery and the natural environment play a really important role in this nationalist sentiment. So the narrative leading up to that final mountaintop scene we just saw follows these urban city dwellers discovering the cultural and ideological and ecological richness of rural Indonesian life. So they decide to slum it by taking an economy class train, and they find themselves admiring the rural people they encounter on their journey for living more authentic and meaningful lives compared with the urban alienation of Jakarta. And when they arrive in East Java, they buy a very simple nasi pecel rice dish wrapped in banana leaves from this old woman at the station, and they all agree that this far surpassed all of the international fast food they had ever tried in Jakarta. And in their interactions with a lot of the local people that they encounter in their journey, I think we can see elements of green Orientalism. So this is a kind of othering practice that has been described by Lohmann and others, where social and ecological desires are projected onto the indigenous and or the global south. And so in this case, I would say that kind of idyllic, harmonious life with nature is projected by those privileged urban travellers onto the rural poor of their own nation. And so while the urban poor are often demonised for creating pollution, as I mentioned earlier, the rural poor are more likely to be held up as living simple, sustainable lives, but not necessarily lives that these protagonists would want to lead themselves, though. These characters, they ultimately achieve a personal and spiritual enrichment through their encounters with both the people and the scenery of rural Indonesia. The natural environment here is a resource to be used in their journey of self-discovery. They spiritually benefit from the journey and return to Jakarta feeling inspired to pursue their goals. And they return to a highly privileged, highly consumerist life back in Jakarta, and their discovery of nature and of nation is represented as a journey of personal development, but not one that changes their behaviour vis-à-vis conservation and the natural environment. And so any environmentalist sentiment in this film is ultimately quite shallow and tends to get subsumed into other discourses, especially the self-development discourse. And this idea of pembangunan diri, or self-development, has been really huge in Indonesia, and the motivational self-help genre is one of the fastest growing genres of the post-reform period, with huge spaces as well. But despite the religious and moral overtones of a lot of this material, common to most of it is actually quite a neoliberal individualist ideology encouraging self-reliance and pursuit of personal wealth. And this is not necessarily going to be a good fit with ecological conservation. But basically, to sum up the 5 centimetre story, I'd like to borrow a phrase that Krishna Sen used at a conference here at Monash a couple of years back and call this movie a kind of extended selfie in which the natural environment facilitates the character's personal development but does not get much back in return. And I think this idea of extended selfie is a good transition to our final scene, which I'm calling Insta-environmentalism. So another of my recent studies has been on the rise of nature tourism and eco-parks. So as cities get more congested, these spaces are increasingly popular with urban youth who travel to appreciate and often to photograph the natural environment. Local governments are capitalising on growing environmental awareness paired with growing demand for great Instagram content to basically sell photo opportunities with nature. So visitors can pose with animal statues, they can lie on grassy beds or in giant birds' nests. They're reminded to put their rubbish into novelty tempat sampah, tampan or cantik, so beautiful bins. There are tire swings, hammocks, kind of mini tree houses, and many of these have a maximum 5 minutes rule, so just enough time to get a great photo and then move on. And so here's another example, with viewing platforms in fun designs jutting out over the valley below, and also a collection of so-called Papuan houses. That's what you have to pay extra to get to the Papuan houses. And these are these small thatched huts that are likely intended to represent a kind of primitive affinity with nature, given the dominant public discourses surrounding Indonesia's easternmost province, which is often portrayed in highly orientalising ways. So again, I think we've got some of this green orientalism going on here. And another familiar trope that crops up in these places is pollution as a matter of personal morality. And so this sign says that only monkeys are allowed to litter, which implies that those who do litter are uncivilised animals. And while there are plenty of conservation messages sprinkled around these parks, so we've got messages here like, we do not inherit this earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our grandchildren, and classic environmental quotes in some of the trees. The natural environment, I would say, is packaged primarily as an Instagram opportunity. And so these spaces, as I said, are very much designed for selfies. And we can see nature being framed quite literally here as an object for fleeting consumption by a mainly urban middle-class audience. As in the case of 5 centimetres and Meikarta, the leisure activity of nature appreciation is a privilege of a relatively wealthy, relatively mobile section of society. And although there are visual cues about going green and those conservation messages earlier, there's almost no conservation practice, apart from the novelty rubbish bins. So snacks and drinks are still sold in many layers of plastic packaging. So there's all these, and a lot of plastic is still left behind. And so there's all of these contradictions between eco messages and consumption practices here. And this is quite common, of course, and not just limited to nature parks. It's a classic case of greenwashing. It's like back in the centre of Jakarta during Car-Free Sunday. So yes, everyone is riding bikes and walking, but at the same time, the streets end up really filled with plastic waste, making it not such an eco-friendly day after all. So we can see in the bottom corner here, Teh Botol are giving away all of these free plastic bottles of tea if you mention them on Instagram. So all of this can seem a bit depressing, but we do still need to give people credit for critical agency. So while it's easy enough to write off this kind of Instagram engagement with nature as shallow, I would say the reality is more complex. So during a lot of focus group discussions with young Indonesians enjoying some of those parks, they're often quite critical. So they raise the issue of economic inequality and express concern over what happens to profit from park entry fees. Does profit go to local people? Does it fund conservation projects? Or simply line the pockets of government officials? Others expressed frustration over the lack of waste disposal options in their daily lives. So why should rubbish bins simply be a novelty item in a tourist park while then littering remains the norm back home? So there's some really interesting conversations happening around this apparently superficial engagement with nature. And social media like Instagram can be a really effective space for taking action. And there are many active eco-campaigners and influencers online in Indonesia. So I've got some pictures from DK Watani's Instagram feed. She's an Instagram influencer who uses Islamic ecological messages to spread conservation practice through a variety of methods, including children's storybooks, which is the top centre image, some of her books. I've also got some images from these young girls, Malati and Isabel, have started a Bye Bye Plastic Bags campaign, where it's called the Tassini campaign, featuring these cute little keychains that become reusable bags. And so these are kind of efforts that would usually be very niche and kind of quite limited in scale, but because they have access to social media platforms, it allows people like this to reach a much wider audience. And if enough people are talking about an issue online, even big companies and governments can feel that social pressure because it can damage their reputation, especially if something goes viral. And it was really interesting doing my research both before and after this dead whale washed up on the coast of Sulawesi last year, with more than 1,000 pieces of plastic waste weighing 6 kilos in its stomach. So this image went viral in Indonesia, and it really seized popular imagination and has actually led to a bit of a shift in public discourse, I think. The mainstream media really covers the plastic waste crisis a lot more, and just the everyday conversations I was having with people shifted quite dramatically. So if I refused a plastic bag when shopping, suddenly I would get knowing nods and references to this whale. So stories and images like this can be quite powerful in setting public agendas. So even though we often think of social media engagement as kind of clicktivism or slacktivism, it can have quite a big impact on kind of framing which issues are seen as worthy of public interest. So across the three examples that I've given today, I will just talk briefly about a couple of the common stories and themes that emerge. So I think class is clearly a big recurring theme here. So enjoyment of nature is often shown as this activity for wealthy folk, while rural and urban poor are overburdened with symbolism and responsibility. So the urban poor are associated with squalor and pollution and are blamed for not being educated enough to dispose of their rubbish properly, while the rural poor are held up as kind of paragons of native or primitive harmony with nature, often in quite orientalising ways. And when we're talking about which kind of stories are most helpful in inspiring big picture collective ecological action, clearly stories that blame and divide populations are not going to be ideal. So as Chakrabarti has put it, a crisis that concerns humanity as a whole cannot ever be adequately addressed if the issues of justice, power and inequality that divide and fragment the same humanity are overlooked in the narratives that we tell ourselves. So in other words, if certain segments of society continue to blame other segments of society, there's not much scope for collective action on some of these issues. And so I think the broader lesson here is about being aware of the way that stories can divide us along different lines, whether that be class, race, gender, religion, and so on, ultimately undermining some of the possibilities for challenging things like patterns of overconsumption and waste that are pushing the natural environment into crisis. Another key recurring theme I've found is personal responsibility and the role that individual morality plays in addressing ecological problems. So it's all very well to promote individual responsibility, but with entrenched and systemic problems, there's only so far that personal morality can get us. And so as we saw in 5 centimetres, images of the environment often get tied up in these quite neoliberal narratives about personal development and national progress, not necessarily in useful ways for conservation practice. This is especially because a lot of the most innovative local solutions to environmental problems are usually very strongly kind of collective and inclusive. So just a couple of examples would be some of the projects of alternative community river mapping in Jakarta, among some of the people living on the banks of the Ciliwung. That's been like really, and that's been engaging online and kind of spreading some of these alternative community maps. Also collaborative art projects with pemulung, or the people who collect rubbish for recycling. There's some really interesting conversations that are happening in these spaces. Another really positive space is eco-pesantren and green Islam, and these growing kind of eco-Islamic movements are really have got a lot of potential in Indonesia, and various kind of collaborations for climate change adaptation. So there's a lot of examples where kind of the stories that are being told are positive and inclusive and set a really strong basis for pro-environmental action, but a lot of these stories never make it into those mainstream representations that I'm looking at, these kind of everyday kind of advertising, popular media, popular film. And so just to kind of start wrapping up, I've been today trying to offer this alternative approach to understanding deeply entrenched ideological challenges that we keep, ecological challenges that we keep coming up against, by looking at popular everyday stories about the natural environment, asking where, why and how some of these dominant narratives are being either reinforced and challenged. And so I think some of those parodies of the Meikarta advertisement is a good example of playful subversion. And in the case of mountain climbing, there are actually Indonesian nature lover groups who will deliberately hike halfway up a mountain and then turn back to avoid some of the kind of conquering and penetrating connotations of erecting a flag at the peak. And online, we've been seeing all of these, lots of different alternative views, and it's always fascinating to see what particular stories will go viral and what will spark public imagination. And I chose these three examples from, I suppose, mainstream popular media because I thought they highlighted nicely different elements of how people approach environmental issues in Indonesia. And they also show some of the challenges and opportunities of several different media types. So advertising, entertainment, social media, they all have kind of different forms, different genre conventions. They offer different possibilities and they have limitations as well. And so today's examples have been quite familiar, banal stories in some ways, but I think it's really important to see how certain narratives are spread and strengthened in these everyday stories in order to more effectively challenge them, to try and tell better stories, and to take action for a more just, inclusive and environmentally sustainable future. Thank you.